Hi, I'm Rob, and welcome back to Series 4 of the Uncut Network. We rotate back and forth between directors, actors, and super specific genres. We cover everything from erotic Euro horror to Barbara Crampton and Radu Jude, touching on everything from exploitation to names more people should know about and things your parents won't endlessly question you for liking, plus everything in between. And to cover all of this and more, I've been joined by Graham. Hello there.
Hello.
And Jonathan. Good to have you back.
Hello, good to be back.
Last time you were on was for... let's go back away. I think it was...
was it the Carol Zeman episode?
Carol Zeman, yeah.
Yeah, Carol Zeman. Yeah.
That was a fun episode, because I just basically said hello to you two of you, because you're so very, very knowledgeable on the subject, and they're my favourite episodes, really, because it's nice to be a spectator in these conversations. I'm not sure if this week's is going to be one, because it's not quite as joyous as Carol Zeman and his sort of a melding of animation and live action. It's Eastern Bloc Sci-Fi. So there's two questions to start off the show. Firstly,
whose fault is this? Yes, it's mine. Thank you.
Well, no, that wasn't one of the questions. I think you kind of have to ask this question in the vague sense, because every episode will lead to a discovery for somebody. Somebody won't know what Eastern Bloc Sci-Fi is, or maybe what even the Eastern Bloc is.
Sure.
So, what is Eastern Bloc Sci-Fi, and what is the reputation it has? I think that sort of keeps it nice and open-ended. So, who wants to tackle that one first?
I guess I'm happy to. I guess I could at least say something about the Eastern Bloc itself as a kind of a geographical, or I guess like geopolitical entity. I guess. Yeah, so I guess the Eastern Bloc, the Eastern Bloc refers to what were the former communist, or I guess more technically state socialist countries that were under the influence of the Soviet Union, including the Soviet Union, and I guess what tends to be more loosely referred to as Eastern Europe, and the various other, the various republics that came under the Soviet Union. So it's really, I guess, as an entity, it's something that lasts from 1948 to early 90s, I would say, to about 1990, 91, let's say. And so, yeah, this is a kind of a part of the world that I guess was not really known particularly for making genre cinema. So although, those countries, USSR, Czechoslovakia, or the former Czechoslovakia, I should say, Hungary, Poland. They did produce a lot of really interesting genre films, but I guess it's not the kind of filmmaking that we associate with that territory. Interestingly, I think in regard to science fiction, if you read accounts of genre filmmaking in this region, you'll sometimes read that they didn't really produce a lot of science fiction films, and yet I think the sci-fi films that they did produce have had perhaps a kind of a disproportionate impact and a disproportionate fame. So I think, for me, I would say it's one of the genres that we tend to associate more with this territory than we do other genres, for instance. In the Soviet Union itself, you had various other kinds of genre cinema, like you had Westerns, or a certain version of the Western, I guess, and you had, of course, comedy, you had musicals, you had war films, of course, but, I think science fiction, although perhaps wasn't made in as big of a quantity, I think the films that were made in the Soviet Union, in Poland, in Czechoslovakia as well, tended to have had quite a large impact internationally. So I think when they did it, they did it well. I guess how that kind of science fiction from this region differs from the science fiction that we know from Western countries or from the US. How that differs, I guess that's one of the questions that we'll look at throughout the episode. I guess one perception, at least, is that, Eastern Bloc sci-fi does tend to be more like philosophically inclined and a little bit less, less, let's say, action oriented. I always think one of the symptomatic signs of the difference between them is that, of course, there was this case in the 1950s of various Soviet sci-fi films being distributed in the US by American International Pictures, and then having various things added to them, they would kind of you'd get somebody like Roger Corman, or I guess in one case even Francis Ford Coppola.
Indeed.
There's a famous case of Francis Ford Coppola being involved as an editor, basically to kind of make and shoot new sequences and edit these into the films just because they wanted to sex them up or give them a little bit more action. And to me, that kind of says a little bit about the difference where, I think the Eastern Bloc sci-fi tends to be a little bit more serious, let's say, quote unquote. Of course, I think one of the films that we're looking at may perhaps give the lie to that perception, but I think definitely that is the idea that we tend to have, that these films were more philosophical, more serious, and I guess politics, of course, is always there. I guess just as it is really in American sci-fi too. And I think the three titles we've chosen perhaps give us various angles on how these films can be related to political themes.
Yes, I think one of the reasons why science fiction tends to get related to Eastern Bloc cinema more than, as you say, comedies or musicals, which did exist, as hard as it may be for people to imagine Stalinist musicals. They were there, they were real.
Yes, very hard to imagine. Just
yeah. But one of the things about science fiction is that it was fairly consistently found to be acceptable by these various countries' censors because it could be turned to ideologically correct of reasoning. These could be films that envisage how wonderful mankind's future among the stars could be if we continued to follow socialism. Now, that doesn't mean that these films all have that message. In fact, they're quite politically divergent, and that was often the case in Eastern Bloc nations. That it was easier than you would think to get in under the censor's radar and do something that was quite subversive. But it meant that there was a consistent interest in making science fiction right back to the silent days when the Soviet Union was producing stuff like Alita and things like that. Yeah,
that's a really good point, I think, about how it does parallel the sort of, I guess, the
thinking
development. The thinking, and I think the relation to science and technology. And I think, as you say, I guess Alita is a really good example, isn't it, where you have that kind of utopian representation of space, and I think also, I guess it's not coincidental that one of the most prolific periods for sci-fi, or a certain kind of sci-fi, in the USSR and elsewhere in Eastern Europe is during the 50s and early 60s, which is, of course, that period of space exploration and the big, huge triumphs, I guess, in space technology by the Soviet Union under Khrushchev, and which of course culminates in Gagarin and the first, man in space.
This is one of those areas where you have to sort of. It's one thing to look at how these films are very culturally different from Western science fiction films, and I do think that's important, but you can't just other them. Eastern Bloc science fiction flourished in the 50s and 60s for the same reason that Western science fiction did. It's because suddenly everything seemed possible. We were going into space. We would surely have moon colonies by the year 2000, and a lot of the film, in fact, all of the films we've chosen are from slightly outside of that era. And I guess they represent a sort of attitude that started to creep into Western science fiction around the same time. This idea of, what if it's not all perfect? What if something does go wrong?
Yeah. See what I mean, listeners? It's wonderful. You just set them off on the topic and you learn something new, absolutely.
I've read, I can't remember where I read it now, but there was a kind of like a narrative that was presented of how this sort of how the sensibility changed, I guess, after, like in the Soviet or Eastern Bloc context, at least after 1969, after, of course, the Americans land somebody on the moon, which I guess for the Soviet Union is a kind of a disaster because, this means they've lost the space race. And of course, I guess there's that wider sense of like disillusion that comes in the Brezhnev era. And that, I guess, according to this narrative, there is a sort of a shift from that kind of sense of optimism or the association of science fiction with optimism toward this much more despairing quality. So through the 70s and 80s, the films, I mean, the sci-fi films that you see there, they tend to be about like apocalypse, or they take on a much more despairing, much darker quality. I don't know if I find that a little bit too neat as a narrative, because I guess it maybe says more about the personalities of individual filmmakers like Tarkovsky, for example. I mean, clearly he was never going to make a very kind of straightforward, optimistic sci-fi film. But yeah, I find there is, I think we do see that kind of shift, though. I think that, certainly after the 60s, you don't really see that kind of like optimistic space exploration type of movie, I guess, except there are a few rare cases. There's that film, I think it was a East German, I believe East German Romanian film called In the Dust of the Stars, which is kind of like a late, that I think I believe is going to be released soon as well, which I'm really happy about, because that is a truly bizarre, very kind of beautiful. It's like a beautiful piece of kitsch, really, and it's kind of like one of those late. It's a very late entry, I guess, in that kind of that more triumphalist vein of sci-fi. But yeah, I guess that's a bit of an outlier, really. I guess otherwise, it's more things like Tarkovsky's films, like the Lopushansky films, and I think there is a different vibe, I guess, in the 70s and 80s.
Vibe is the perfect way to sort of jump on that, because the three movies that we're talking about have two very, very different vibes. Two could be considered bleak, and one should be considered bleak, but maybe that's not the truth of what that movie is. And those three movies are from 1979. We have Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker. You also could have picked Solaris, but that's a very different type of sci-fi, I think. From 1985, this is the order we're going to be doing them in, because we need to finish on something a little bit upbeat, is Peter Szulkin's, I think, or Bar the End of Civilization, which gives you a hint with the title. It's a very evocative title.
Rom-com. Yeah.
No. And you could make a case that this is a rom-com as well as a time-travelling Hitler comedy with doppelgangers and musical numbers. Jindrik Polak's Tomorrow I'll Wake Up and Spoiled Myself with Tea from 1977. Three very, very, very different movies we've got in the bag there.
And all from different countries, it should be noted. Stalker is Soviet, Obiyoba is Polish, Tomorrow I'll Wake Up is Czech.
Пусть исполнится то, что задумано. Пусть они поверят. И пусть посмеются над своими страстями. Ведь то, что они называют страстью, на самом деле не душевная энергия, а лишь трение между душой и внешним миром. А главное, пусть поверят в себя и станут беспомощными, как дети. Потому что слабость велика, а сила ничтожна. Когда человек родится, он слаб и гибок. Когда умирает, он крепок и черств. Когда дерево растет, оно нежно и гибко. А когда оно сухо и жестко, оно умирает. Черствость и сила – спутники смерти. Гибкость и слабость выражают свежесть бытия. Поэтому что отвердело, то не победит.
We'll start off with Stalker first. Now, here is the question that sunk a million internet arguments. I'll set off a million internet arguments. What is Stalker about? Because that is a loaded question. I do realise that.
Well, there's an opening credits scroll that actually sort of sets out the premise pretty accurately, I think. It says, a long time ago in a galaxy far, far... Oh, wait, wrong tab. It says that a meteorite has crashed in the Soviet Union. It's never quite clear where. It's probably Estonia. And it's created a region called the Zone. And scientists are completely at a loss as to explain what is happening in the zone, and in the absence of any official information or any measurable results, extraordinary rumours have started to take root that the laws of physics don't apply. It's an alien spaceship, and more central to this story, that anyone who goes into the zone will have their ultimate desires granted. So it becomes, as well as a major disaster area, a major tourist destination of kinds. People are led in and out of the zone by these individuals known as stalkers, who have the sort of ability to pass in and out of the zone because they are these kind of, I guess, transcendent figures. You know, they are figures who seem to lack desire. They are figures who are not susceptible to what happens in the zone, because on one level, Stalker is a classic monkey's paw tale. It turns out that your desires might not be what you think they are when you enter the zone.
Yes. So, Jonathan, what are your immediate thoughts on Stalker? Because this one could get quite elaborate, the themes that it touches upon.
I mean, I'll just kind of like start with my own like personal sort of relationship with the film, I think. I mean, I'm really glad that I had a chance to talk about it on this podcast, because it's always been a film that's been, I guess, along with a lot of Tarkovsky's work in general, it's sort of at the back of my mind, there's always been this kind of guilty conscience that's been telling me to rewatch them. And because I saw a lot of them, I think I saw most of his films when I was a lot younger. And as often happens, I was probably too young to really appreciate them. And I'm quite bad at like rewatching things. I tend to just I like to watch new things. And of course, most of them are long. And so it's just putting in that investment. So I was glad to have the opportunity to go back to it, really. And I think, I watched it a couple of times, preparing for this. And as to, my own feelings about the film, I mean, it's something that I think I have appreciated more on a third viewing. I wouldn't say I've kind of like I wouldn't say I've had like a big revelation as to like I've suddenly like discovered what it's about. I kind of think the first time I saw it, I had pretty decent grasp on like the themes, and I think the theme of faith, which I think is kind of like a very strong theme throughout the film. And I was reading some commentary on it from, I actually read some of Graham Petrie's book, which I think is called Tarkovsky, The Films of Tarkovsky, a visual fugue, I think is the title of that book. And he makes a really interesting point about it. He says that it's easy to sort of assume that it's quite an obscure film, but actually he says the themes are pretty much on the surface in a way. I mean, I think the characters do talk at length really about, various ideas about faith and, cynicism and, love and things like that. But I think what kind of did resound with me, having watched it multiple times, is just the beauty and the complexity of the style, I think, and of the visual realization. And there were things that I noticed watching it again that I'd not really picked up on before. So, for example, there are lots of little tricks that it plays, I think, with the viewer's perception. So, I'm thinking just as a sort of a small example, like when you see the birds flying in that room with the sand, there's one moment where one of the birds just disappears, and it's just like a little editing trick. And I think the way that it plays with your perception is something that I noticed having watched it like a second and a third time. And yeah, I think probably if I were to go back to it again, I would notice even more. And so, yeah, I kind of take from that it's really a film that you are meant to experience as much as to understand. And I feel that it's almost meant to put you in the same position as the characters, where they're kind of seeking something from this space that they're in. And of course, they're constantly being confused, or they're being baffled by what is around them. And their sense of space and direction is constantly being played about with. And I feel that as a viewer, we are put into that position too. So that's something that I really took, I think, from being able to watch it, second and third time, really.
Yeah. I first watched it for Cinema Eclectica, show that we used to do on this network, and I think the main takeaway I had was that it was very funny to me that this was famously like the basis of a series of video games, not just because video games tend not to be based on 3-hour Russian art house films, although that is true, but because it doesn't have the thing that video games really took from cinema, the really foundational thing, which is x-axis and z-axis travel. If you think back to the earliest video games, back when they were all two-dimensional in their look, you have lots of traveling across the screen, you have lots of traveling up the screen. Stalker is a movie about a voyage where everything is on the z-axis, everything is like into the frame rather than across or up the frame. And it gives you this sense of falling. You don't know where this journey is going to end, because rather than traveling across the landscape or up the mountain, everyone is just going further and further and further into the fog, into the woods. And it's that sense of motion without purpose that is so fascinating. There's a famous shot in it, which is just a tracking shot of the bottom of a riverbed, which is covered in rubbish.
Yeah.
And on its own terms, it is the ugliest thing. There's no beauty in it at all, but the shot just keeps going on and on.
Yeah.
And it's it's an illustration of Tarkovsky's famous quote that, a shot that's boring at 10 seconds might be interesting at 30 seconds. And if it's not interesting at 30 seconds, try it at 45 seconds.
Yeah.
The thing that is daunting about it, which is the fact that it is so long and so slow, is the thing that makes it hypnotic, in my view.
It's so very, very different than the sort of traditionally excellent long take cinematography. Like the one that really stands out for me when you talk about that is in Godard's Weekend, where it's just going along the side of this. Me referencing Godard, fancy that.
Exactly, yeah, I'm so happy.
But this shot at the beginning where it just goes past a road and it's just all of the people in this traffic jam, and it's just so full of stuff. But to go back to that shot, it kind of gets into the space of what Stalker is. There's very, very few movies that I've watched. This is the first time watching me, but there's very, very few movies that I've seen in my life where it feels like you're not really watching a movie. It's like when it's stopped, it feels like you've been somewhere else, you've travelled somewhere else, and you've just come back home. The other recent example I can think of is a very, very different movie, but the effect was Ken Russell's Altered States, which, because it's talking about sensory deprivation, it has that sort of weirdness about it, that otherness in the space that you occupy in the movie, and it's very odd sensation for any movie to embody. A very hard movie for any movie to embody, I think, at least.
Totally, yeah. And I still think like a lot of Tarkovsky stuff got folded into this kind of overarching umbrella of slow cinema over the course of the 2000s and 2010s, and I still feel like slow cinema is one of those things where I just do not know how it's going to land with me. I can't predict which ones are going to like just make me think, well, that's just a normal film, but you've slowed it down to look clever. But every now and then you do see something like Stalker where you think, well, that's like looking at Stonehenge. You know, it is a monument rather than a film.
I mean, I'm really glad you mentioned the shot in the water, yeah, because that was one of the ones I wanted to single out as well, really. And I think what's fascinating in that shot is it starts with the stalker. I think it pans away from him, or it tracks away from him, and then at the end of the shot, it comes back to him, and you've no idea like what direction it's been moving in, or how it's changed direction, how it's done this circuit back to him. And I think again, it's just representing that. It's that constant sense of misdirection, isn't it, or of this sense of following this very oblique dimension or oblique direction, and yeah, I think it is, and it's just hypnotic, isn't it, as well? I think it's like nothing is happening, but it's just it really creates just such a strong sense of environment. And there's another sequence that's often, I think, cited as one of the great moments in it, which is the journey to the zone. And again, I mean, that's something that feels like it should be. I mean, I think people say, don't they, that it feels like it's one shot, and actually, I think there's about five, but I think he's able to create that impression of continuity. And it's a really strange sequence, that, because, I mean, nothing happens. All you see is the faces of the three men, and yet you have the sound, and it just lulls you into this hypnotic state. And I was kind of quite amused to see that this movie, I think, comes up occasionally on lists of like ASMR movies, which is kind of funny, but in a way, it's not like totally like ill-placed, because I guess he is trying to create that sense of like environmental. It's like that sense of environmental. What's the word? Like emplacement. I think it's that sense of being totally enfolded in this world where, you know, the sounds and almost like your senses are somehow alive to the kind of world around you. And it was a bit strange, but yeah, it does make sense, I think, on some level.
Yeah, it's weird to say that, because there's this thing now where you can watch movies through VR headsets, and I feel like this would be an excellent use of that. Just sort of the movie, encapsulating you, really. I think that'd be a good use of that technology. I know it won't be. It may mainly be used for porn or something, but as far as sort of the technology and the idea, I think it'd be really good for a movie like this. But the one thing I do want to bring up is the use of colour, because it's when you talk about movies that start off as monochrome or black and white and suddenly get colour, you're talking about Wizard of Oz. Which does it very, very famously. This also has it, not quite as saturated and over the top, but it's there, because at the beginning, when they're outside of the zone, it's very bleached out, drained looking. I think is it the writer, where he's talking in that section about life being boring and nothing interesting happens, and there's not going to be aliens. Life's too boring for aliens. Everything's so very, very mundane. But in the zone, it just light and life all comes in. It's all sort of along the theme of nature's taken over again, I think, because it's a very industrial like cityscape where everybody's living this burnt out industrial cityscape. Yeah.
I just want to say how much I love the idea that had not occurred to me before now, that Stalker is the Soviet Wizard of Oz. I mean, the parallel actually works wonderfully well.
Yeah, yeah.
And whatever album is you can play alongside Wizard of Oz, you can do it a few times with Stalker, so you're all good. But it's a very visually, not just visually in the sense of what the camera does, because it's a very slow-moving, deliberate cinematography, which is very, very different than one of my other filmmakers that I really love, Roy Anderson. He just planks the camera still for however long and just puts these tableaus upon it. But that sort of long-take cinematography and static cameras, or near-static cameras, is very interesting, I think, as well as the use of colour there too.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I guess there is that basic opposition of, you know, ordinary life outside the zone is black and white or is monochrome, and then inside the zone it's color. But then he starts to break that down, doesn't it? Because then you get monochrome sequences inside the zone. And then I guess by the end, when you're with the family, it's in color again. So yeah, I think that dichotomy is there, but I think it's also interesting how he plays with that. And it makes us think, well, why are those final sequences in color? I mean, I think it does go back to monochrome, doesn't it, when they're back in the bar again? Yeah. But then the scenes with the family and with the daughter, we're back in color again. So yes, I think there's an interesting interplay there, which I'm not quite clear I've got a handle on, but yeah, I think it's interesting, to kind of establish that pattern, but then to sort of disrupt it as well.
I think
Tarkovsky is one of these directors who every detail meant something. Yeah, and this is a pretty simple question. He wasn't an incidental or accidental filmmaker by any means of the imagination. So what's the dog about? I didn't quite get that. What's the significance of the dog?
I don't know about the dog. I was going to say, one of the things I want to say, I know there is like this huge body of work about Tarkovsky, including like a lot of it written by Tarkovsky himself, but there's very little of it that I've actually read, to be honest. But I know, one thing that I kept thinking when I was watching this was I feel like I can sort of see what this meant to Tarkovsky, but I can also imagine how you would pitch this to like Mosfilm, to the like Moscow production company, because it would be very easy to say this is a parable about greed. Everyone is undone by their sort of materialist, kind of self-interested lust for glory, their lust for material possessions, except the Stalker, who is above this. And it's very easy to make that into a kind of a communist parable. But to Tarkovsky, of course, who was a Christian and was more conservative in his politics, you see the Stalker almost as this figure of divine grace, someone who's transcended the material world. And I think part of the ambiguity of it and part of the strange little loose ends, like the final scene or the dog, which again, beats me, part of it is just this attempt to create a text that is complex enough that it can encompass what he wants it to say and also what it must say.
Yeah. Not to diverge too much, but I think for me, I feel that's done better in Andrei Rublev. It captures that more for me, but it's each to their own, I suppose. But Jonathan, you've got to say there, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, Tarkovsky, I guess in terms of his own answers as well, his own responses or his comments on his films, from what I've read of them, he was very resistant to symbolism. He didn't like being asked what something represents or something symbolizes. Yeah. And of course, we can take that as very much it's a director playing with his public, because of course, I think if any filmmaker invites symbolism, I mean, he is one of the ones that would qualify, I guess. And the dog does lend itself to some kind of symbolic reading. I don't know exactly what that is. I mean, it's interesting how, by the end of the film, I guess it is adopted as a kind of family dog, isn't it, at the end? So it's become part of the family. And I don't know whether it's related on some level to the theme of wishes or desires, but yeah, I can't sort of attach a specific meaning to that. Its appearances are kind of marked, though, aren't they? I think we are meant to kind of like to identify the moments when it does appear. But I can't find a specific meaning that it has. I know that Tarkovsky did have a dog, apparently, that he loved very much. So I don't know whether there's some...
Maybe that's just it. Maybe that's it. You don't love dogs. Yeah.
What else was there? Anything else? There was something I was going to say, but it's totally escaped me. But anything else either of you want to mention about Stalker before we move on?
I just wanted to mention maybe the political dimension, because I guess this is something that has been attributed to the film, and of course was to a certain extent outside of Tarkovsky control, but this has often been read as prophetic, of course, of the Chernobyl disaster, which I think was 86. So I guess, quite a you know, 7 years into the future. But yeah, I guess that is kind of like a retroactive meaning that's often been given to it.
That was something that, you know, people embraced too, that there was a whole sort of group of people whose job it was to go into the exclusion zone at Chernobyl and make sure that, you know, things weren't starting to break down again, and perform maintenance, make sure there were no stray animals going in and out. And they did refer to themselves as stalkers, which I think is extraordinary. I love that fact.
Yeah, I think it was Jeff Dyer who made a really interesting point. I think in that, I guess in relation to the impact that the film had, and he said that there was a book of photographs published of the I guess of the site and of things that had happened there. And he said, well, on the one hand, it does evoke Stalker, but on the other hand, he feels perhaps the photographers themselves, as they were taking the photos, perhaps they were already influenced by the aesthetic of Stalker. So in a certain weird sense, the film itself actually shaped people's perception and their kind of aesthetic, or their means of representing it. So yes, it's a really interesting relationship that the film has with things that happened after, because yeah, I guess, and I think more generally, I guess, I wonder how much of our perception of the kind of late Soviet period is this kind of crumbling wasteland, how much that owes to Tarkovsky, because I think he is the master of that kind of environment, isn't he really? And
yes.
Yeah,
because this is the Soviets' contribution to that late 70s, early 80s terrible shoot Olympics, isn't it? America had Apocalypse Now, Germany had Fitzcarraldo, and the USSR had Stalker, an absolutely unbearable shoot, which is often blamed for the cancer that killed Tarkovsky.
Yeah.
The fact that we're shot in old chemical labs, chemical waste facilities.
Yes.
Yeah, it is a pretty big finger pointing at this movie, really, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hello.
Picking the mood up a bit, we move into the second movie of the evening, which was previously put out in a box set by Radiance. They had 3 movies of his, the other 2 being Gaga, Glory of Heroes, and War of the World's Next Century. But the one of the 3 that we are talking about instead of those is 1985's Or Be or Bar, End of Civilization. I think I got that name right, End of Civilization? I've lost my tab. End of Civilization by Petr Szulkin. I'm assuming I've got that wrong because Polish is very hard to pronounce things from. But Jonathan, what is Or Be or Bar?
So A Be or Bar is set in an unspecified future in the aftermath of a nuclear apocalypse. And the nuclear apocalypse has basically killed most of the world's inhabitants, covered the world in radiation. And after the war, there were about 2,000 survivors, and they were essentially herded into this protective dome. And so at the point that the movie is set, we're sometime after that, and at this point, humanity has dwindled to, I think it's about 850, it's very specific, about 850 people who are still surviving. Yeah. And our protagonist is called Soft, and he's played by the great Polish actor Jerzy Stur. And Soft is a kind of propaganda specialist, and his role after the apocalypse was to help to foster this myth about this giant ark that would come one day and save everybody. And this was purely a means of manipulation to get people to come into this ark and to come into this dome and to try and survive there. So during the duration of the movie itself, we see basically a lot of the life inside of the dome. We see how that is basically falling apart on every level, socially, psychologically, materially. I mean, the dome is literally cracking apart at the seams. Soft meets a succession of really crazy characters, all of whom seem to have their own fantasies about deliverance by this ark. And he becomes rather despairing at the sense of passivity around him. And then ultimately he decides that maybe he can use this myth of the ark to try to, I think he puts it as like to rouse people from their lethargy and to get them active and to try and help them to save themselves. But as the movie goes on, of course, not much of a spoiler, but this doesn't really go according to plan. And ultimately Soft himself, I think, becomes more and more mired in his own rather futile sense of hope and fantasy. And perhaps it does end well, depending on how we read the final scene. But yes, it's basically a very bleak post-apocalyptic commentary on religion, faith, and possibly late communism as well.
Graham?
I'm really glad that you took the synopsis for this, because this was the one that clicked the least with me. I found it very impressive, but I also, something about it did not quite gel. I think if you're looking towards these films and wondering, which one of them might be the most accessible for someone who's only watched Western science fiction, you could make the case that Obi Yobar is a good bridge. It was made in the mid-80s, and it does have this kind of high style, which is not a million miles away from the kind of high style that a Hollywood film from the same time, like a Hollywood auteur piece, really, like Manhunter or Brazil, might have. There's a lot of colour gels, a lot of very moody blue lighting. Everyone is sort of competing to give the weirdest performance in these big long snaking takes. I like all that stuff, and as I describe it, I'm thinking I should have enjoyed it more. But I suppose when you stack it against something like Stalker, where you can approach the central meaning of it from pretty much any direction, I found the meaning of it was slightly too on the surface for me. I interpreted it largely as a film about political propaganda that was made possible as a result of the sort of, Poland had a very unique way out of communism, which is that there was this time with the Solidarity movement in the early 80s where it looked like they might be able to break away from the Soviet Union about 10 years before anyone else. And as a result, there were a lot of very subversive, very political films made in Poland in the 1980s that probably wouldn't have been possible in other Soviet-backed countries. So I admired Szulkin's ability to get this very upfront political film made, but I found the upfrontness of it a bit less satisfying, I think.
That's interesting. I mean, I quite enjoyed it, especially from the idea that it's a visual movie. The idea that a visual movie which takes place in basically old bunkers, bombed out buildings, rooms with nothing in, essentially, but just broken down bits of old civilization could be kind of beautiful.
Yeah.
It's the use of gels and bars of light. It's an exceptionally handsome movie. I know this is entirely surface, which isn't really going to dissuade you there, Graham, but it has just some shots that will really, really stick with me. And there's one at the end, which is no more complicated than a huge light source and smoke. But when it does inevitably fail, and just anarchy unfolds, it's one of the most striking shots I've seen, at least this year. It's a very, very handsome movie for something which is so hamstrung. Because you look at other movies in this sort of mold, and it's just lots of miserable people talking to each other in brown rooms.
Yes, yeah.
This couldn't be further from that, really, and that really stood out for me. I think just as just looking at it as a the digital, I'm wording this, the photography, the cinematography, the visual angle. I think it really stands out for me. Very, very handsome movie. Because look at Polish cinema as well. It's not known as one of the great photography or cinematography countries, is it? But this is kind of an anathema of that, really.
I always find Polish movies fit neatly into like two halves. There's the sort of Andrzej Żuławski style of Polish cinema where it's meant to give you a seizure, and then there's the sort of Andrzej Wajda side, which is meant to make Ken Loach look like, James Cameron.
Yeah, there was that movement known as the cinema of moral concern in the 70s and 80s, which I think Żuławski said these are essentially, it's like photograph. I think he used the term photographed radio or something like that. That was his view of the cinema. I wouldn't necessarily share that, but yeah, I can see where he's coming from. Certainly in comparison with his own movies, yes, it lacks some of that sense of visual dynamism, let's say. I mean,
yeah.
I think Brazil is a really good point of reference with this. And yeah, I would say, the style to me, it's like a mix of Blade Runner and Brazil, isn't it? It's like a grungier version of Blade Runner. And you've got all that kind of detritus and just little, and I kind of like the way it recreates this sense of this post-apocalyptic environment in which you've just got bits and pieces of civilization that have been cobbled together to create this society that they're in. And there's nice little touches. I always am amused by the fact that you see a security guard at one point. He's wearing what looks like an American football helmet, and you've got this sense that they've just like found anything that has been left over from the civilization that they've had to just like utilize in some way. And I kind of know what you mean about the political angle, and I always find it quite fascinating that I believe Szulkin said that he didn't really want his movies to be read like this, and apparently he was quite adamant that they were not just about like the political situation in Poland. And to me, it's quite hard not to see that because the parallels are just so clear, I think. I mean, I guess there are other ways you can read them, but to me, it is, as you say, it's very on the nose, I think, isn't it? The parallels with that sense of like the crumbling world of like late communist Poland or late communist Eastern Bloc. And some of the parallels are very specific too, I think. I think of the fact, for instance, that this is a world in which people are just doing these like meaningless tasks that they've been assigned to do. And I think that very much represents that feeling under communism that people would just, they were just working for the sake of working. They weren't really doing anything very meaningful. They were just sitting around in workplaces. I think there's a very sort of specific recreation of that environment. So yeah, it is difficult to know how not to. It's difficult to sort of see it on another level somehow, I think. I mean, I guess there is a critique of religion there too, isn't there, really? So I guess, but
well, I think
to me that
Oh, sorry. Well, no, I think in the film's defense, I think part of the reason why I viewed it like that is because I'm totally unfamiliar with Szulkin. I think I had vaguely heard of some of his films, but before a slew of them arrived on Mubi a few months back, I had certainly never seen one. So perhaps I read it as more straightforward because I'm kind of grabbing onto some context that I can understand for it.
I think of the 4 sci-fi films that he made, I would say probably this is the one that suggests the most parallels with or perhaps this and War of the Worlds, because War of the Worlds has often been read as a like a commentary on the martial law period. So I guess perhaps this or War of the Worlds are, I think, for me, quite closely in parallel with the realities of the time. But yeah, I think it's very difficult to resist that interpretation. Really,
Yeah.
it's kind of interesting what it says in relation to solidarity, because of course solidarity was a movement that was very much involved with the Catholic Church, and so I guess religion or faith did play a very strong part in that resistance to communism. And yet in this film, I feel the commentary on religion, at the least, is quite ambivalent, because I think it's very much tied to this sense of passivity and apathy that the characters have. So, yes, it's interesting because I guess it is critical of communism implicitly, but I guess it's not really very affirmative either of religion. And I guess it's interesting too that you have this image of the money that they're making. They're producing these coins from this dilapidated aeroplane, and I guess you could say there's possibly a kind of a critique there of capitalism too, and there's various other little strands to it. But yeah, I think it's hard to kind of avoid that very obvious parallel with the late communist period.
I sort of use it as a parallel for Czech cinema. It's okay because there's only so many times you can do movies that are very much about something in a direct fashion. You look at Soviet cinema, I can't remember what year, I think it was Sergei Eisenstein, sorry. Did a movie in 1932 called Strike, which was an incredible movie about just that, about working in a communist hellscape, really. Some earlier ideas of montages in cinema too. But once you've had so many examples of something tackling something directly, it's just sort of... It's fundamentally a redundant exercise, isn't it? And when you look at Czech cinema, Czech movies all fundamentally have largely a very, very similar subtext to them. But the movies that are produced through that subtext are so incredibly diverse and divergent. And I think that really stands at Obi-Oba in good stead, because it is of that stock. It is saying the same things about communism, about organised religion, about all of these things, but it's doing it within the package of something which is interesting. It's an interesting genre exercise, I think. And
I think the big stereotype people have about Eastern Bloc movies is that they're all like the movie equivalent of Cabbage, and you should you should have them because they're good for you, but you're not going to get any really powerful flavours. And even I would say that this is a really unfair characterization of something like Obi-Oba, which is really stylish and colourful and weird and
Czech cinema as well. Czech cinema is so bonkers. But thematically, they're all very alike. So it's interesting as a sort of a idea that you can only make so many stories about a certain subject matter, because these movies have taken it from so many different angles that it's really showing. I mean, this is another one of the stereotypes, that there's no imagination in these places. They're all just old farming villages where people get turnips out of the ground and then have babies and then die. That's the horrible stereotype that people have of these places. But it persists for some reason, and these movies show that there's some real artists working in these countries, I think.
It's so funny to me that we think that, like, Western capitalist nations invented entertainment somehow. That always seems to be the subtext of it, right? Yeah.
That is the implication that a lot of people have with these countries, like your Hungaries, like your Poland's, places like this. They're just all potato farmers, and that's all they do. That's all they should be. It's bonkers, really. And to see a movie of such... It's got a big imagination, this, I think, and a very big visual imagination, too. So I was pleasantly surprised by this one, I'll be honest. Very, very pleasantly surprised.
I think the ending is really impressive, isn't it? And going back to Brazil, it's interesting how similar the ending is to the ending of Brazil.
Yeah.
And I don't think either could have influenced the other, because I believe they were being made around the same time, I think. So it's possibly just a coincidence. But yes, there is a very close analogy, because you have this kind of fantasy escape with this beloved woman who in both cases has actually died already in the narrative. And Yeah, I just thought that was
the woman we should call out is Christina Yander, who I saw late last year in the film Interrogation, where she gives what I think is just one of the all-time great film performances, and certainly one of the great maximalist film performances. It's like Isabelle Adjani in Possession. It's like, Harvey Keitel in Bad Lieutenant. It's one of those performances where you think they probably had to have an exorcist on set just to level them out at the end of it. But she's also sort of playing a similar kind of character in both of them, where they both lionize this woman who, compared to the rest of the cast at least, is quite apolitical. Her character in Interrogation is someone who, was involved in the war, did a bit of anti-Nazi stuff, but is now finding herself being persecuted for being insufficiently fervent about what, the system that replaced Nazism. And in this, she has a similar kind of vibe. She's the one person in this who's going to go, I don't give a fuck if the Ark exists, if I'm brutally honest. I don't want any part of these overarching schemes. I don't want to be part of a centrally planned society. You can picture if these characters turned up in another era of Eastern Bloc cinema, they would be the villains. But in the 80s, and particularly in Poland, people were ready to see those people as the heroes, the moral voices even.
Any closing thoughts? I mean, the passing one for me is I just love how all of these movies have the stereotype of the nightclub, and to see the nightclub scene or scenes that it happens multiple times in such a unremittingly bleak existence. It's kind of a pleasant little wrinkle, a pleasant little detail, I think. Whether it was a generic, just every other movie has this, so we'll have it, or it's just a commentary in that, I'm not sure, but it was a nice little detail that I appreciated.
I believe there was a lot of drinking on both sets of both films, so I guess having a lot of bars and nightclubs in them is kind of is appropriate, I suppose.
All it for OB Bar? We all covered?
I think that's it for me. Yeah, I will say I am eager to see some more Szulkin, just to get more of a grip on his directorial personality.
There was another one which sounded particularly compelling called Golem. Which is another one of his most well regarded, at least on Letterboxd. So that's from '79 also, which seemed to be such a rich year for this stuff.
Totally.
I must rewatch Golem. Yeah, I was very impressed by that, but I found that the most mystifying of all of his films, really. But I need to rewatch it. The one that really impressed me was the last one that he made called Gaga, Glory to the Heroes. That's really just bonkers. And that also has Jerzy Stur again, but in a very different, in fact, not that different part, because he's playing this kind of crazy TV executive in that. So, that I would say is, that was my favorite, I think, of the four.
Okay.
Máme možnost vyhrát druhou světovou válku.
Heil Hitler!
Dáme vůdci vodíkovou bombu!
Patriku, chceš mě znervóznit?
To bych snad ani nedokázal, Shirley.
Pilulky proti stárnutí taky nechcete.
Patri, a jak se vůbec dostaneme do minulosti?
Popravdě řečeno, Shirley, nemám tušení. Řekl bych, že je to starosté film.
Vážení, jsme v roce 1944, venku zuří válka. Buďte na sebe opatrní, ať nepřijede k úrazu. Armády nebývají galantní.
Zvláště, když vidí takovéhle fešandy. Co si to dovolujete? Jak to přinesli?
Je to Hitler. No je to Hitler. Já už to nebudu vypravovat u nás v Chicagu. Patty, musíš mě s nimi fotografovat. Co kdybyste mě dal takhle ruku kolem ramen? Je to můj kufřík. Co si to dovolujete?
Šilej! Jan chudák. Udusil se rohlíkem.
Tento mladý muž jsem já. Co?
And that leads us to the last one. I'm going to read a synopsis for this because honestly, trying to plot this, I don't know. Yes, so according to Letterboxd, former Nazi Klaus Abad survives to the 1990s by taking anti-aging pills. I think they say he's like 86 at this point. Doesn't look it, but he plans to use a time travel trip because in this world, time travel is just like a holiday. You go to the airport and you can take a trip to see the dinosaurs or whatever your heart sets mind to, really. But they want to this group fronted by Klaus Abad wants to go to 1944 in Germany and present Hitler with an hydrogen bomb so he can win the war. Unfortunately, the pilot is a woman chasing Carol Burris, is it pronounced? I'm not sure. And he dies in the morning with a bread roll, and his earnest brother Jan impersonates him without knowing the plot. And I think I'll leave it there because essentially all it is basically a level of farce and repetition in the sort of the classic time travel caper comedy sense where everything that can go wrong continuously goes wrong, and there's a great deal of the plot points to go through that because you could talk about 15 minutes just going through the plot. It is very, very dense.
It really is, yeah.
So, Jonathan, thoughts on Tomorrow I'll Wake Up and Scold Myself with Tea?
Well, this is I think a very special film for me. Although there's a great story of how this film was discovered in Britain, and so this was a film that I first heard about from a friend who was looking for it. This is going back maybe 20 years or so, but this film was shown in 1982 on British TV, I think on BBC Two, late one evening, and apparently it developed this kind of mini kind of cult following. And so, there were various people who saw it in the UK at the time and I guess remembered it, but of course, because of the title, possibly had forgotten the title. And of course, it was very difficult to track down for a long time. So that's how it was first introduced to me as this weird cult film about time travel and Nazis. And I think when I first saw it, it was maybe about 2006, maybe, I think. And I'm glad that I hadn't really seen a lot of Czech or Czechoslovak comedies by this time. So it was very fresh. And I guess when you put it in the context, it's not quite as bizarre as it might look. Just as as a sort of as an outsider, I guess, because there was a whole series of comedies that were made in Czechoslovakia through the 60s and 70s into the early 80s that tended to have these kind of bizarre long titles and that tended to revolve around comedy and farce and genre elements. So usually science fiction, usually there would be some kind of science fiction motif, like time travel or some kind of some kind of bizarre machine. So I guess in that context, it doesn't look quite as strange. But I think even in that context, it's still a pretty wild ride, I think. I mean, I think from what I can find, I mean, when I've looked at like the reviews of it and the kind of the way that it was promotionally sort of packaged in Czechoslovakia, the makers tried to sell it as kind of like a satire on fascism. That was like one of the sort of angles that they chose for it, which is just kind of funny to me, because I would not say that it's particularly like a hard-hitting satire on Nazism. It's just one of those. It's just one of the many elements that's thrown into the mix, really. And yeah, I think it's just a bizarre, sort of fun film, really. I don't know if there's a lot of like depth to it beyond that, really. I think it's just a wild, farcical adventure, I think.
Yeah, I think Czech comedies are so inventive to me, and they're a huge part of why I love the like Czech and Slovak cinema, is because they did make things like this, of Aldrich Lipsky's Happy End, or I Killed Einstein, Gentlemen, where they're mainstream comedies and they're very fun and they're pacey and they're gag packed, but they do revolve around these big original ideas. And I mean, the time travel plot, the actual mechanism of the time travel in Tomorrow I'll Wake Up and Scald Myself with tea, is something that still looks absolutely dizzyingly complicated now, now that we've seen so many time travel films and shows since then. But at one point, the Nazis go back to commit a daring robbery on themselves, on like a past version of themselves. They bodge the first version of the plan up that they have to go back and stop themselves from doing something. So it's like, time travel normally comes with this really rigorous set of rules about, you can't cross your own time stream, you can't like kill your own parents, you can't enter a paradox, and none of those exist in these films. Firstly, because the people doing the time traveling are absolutely abhorrent bastards who don't care how much of a mess they cause. But also because it is a comedy, and comedy is about transgressing rules. And if the film gets itself in an absolutely absurd knot with predestination paradoxes and things like that, that's not a problem, as it would be in a serious time travel movie. That's actually very funny. It's funny to watch people get more and more in this mess.
It's funny, actually, isn't it? Because I guess it's easy to get fixated on the sort of Hitler and the sort of the giving Hitler a bomb sort of aspect of the plot. But in a way, once that stuff's done, it gets even crazier, doesn't it? Because then you start to get into all these complications of like doubled and then tripled identities. And in a way, the real fun begins like after that. So, yeah, I mean, that's only like one part of it, isn't it, really? And yeah, I every time I watch it, I have to concentrate and I have to kind of figure out, well, how has the narrative changed? Because he's gone back a second time and now he's gone back a third time, and it's like, what has happened now that's different? How has he affected the course of events each time he goes back? And yeah, it like you say, it just keeps like upping the level of complication. And yeah, the way that the Nazis have to like they have to like sabotage their own past identities, don't they? And I think they start like killing the past versions of themselves. But of course, and I think one of the funniest moments for me is, I think the character called the character played by Vladimir Menshik, who's like the kind of the bodyguard, or kind of like the heavy. I think he's called, is it Klaus or Kraus? I've forgotten now the name.
Yeah.
But he kills one of the others because he's a duplicate, and he says, well, because if two of them survived, like they would have to live on like one salary. And it's just that kind of bizarre, it's that sort of level of like banal real world consideration combined with this just insane like sci-fi plot. To me, that's a very distinctive quality, I think, of the comedies from Czechoslovakia, that I think they always maintain this grip on like the real world, but like juxtapose it with just the most bizarre kind of sci-fi conceits as well. And it's, to me, a very unique quality, I guess.
And I think the thing that makes them unique to me as well is that there's a lot of science fiction comedy around, but a lot of it is science fiction parody, some of which is great. You know, I enjoy a science fiction spoof as much as anyone, but it's like these films aren't that. They are science fiction films with big original science fiction concepts that take their time travel or whatever it's about very seriously, but they are also very funny. And that's something that I think, you know, now that a general audience is science fiction literate and all of these things like the multiverse that used to be in the most, you know, niche of niche science fiction publications can now be the foundation for blockbusters. I would like to see a lot more of that. I think it's something that we could bring back.
And I mean, the director of this, Polák, of course, had made Icarus XB1 in the 60s, and so, which I think is probably I would say probably now the most celebrated, and I think deservedly so, the most celebrated Czechoslovak science fiction film. And of course, that's totally straight, but I think you can see some of the same care for the creation of the effects and the creation of the sort of sci-fi elements. I mean, I think the effects in this, I think for the time and place, are pretty good, really.
Yeah,
I think
I mean, it's one of those things where the effects don't have to be good because it's comedy, and a shoddy effect lands differently in a comedy than it would in a serious film. But there's kind of a gradient, isn't there? Like, he knows that you can make the freeze ray look funny. That visual of people's faces just turning green as they freeze, and occasionally like could still talk. They're just stood there completely still going, It's really funny. But when it gets to things like the sort of lunar lander coming down, it's a really impressive special effects sequence. You know, there's nothing shabby or tongue-in-cheek about that. It looks good because, as you say, he had done things like Carry XB1. He did know his way around an impressive effects sequence.
World building as well. It's a comedy, and it has no business being as good as it is, really.
Yeah.
It doesn't really make a show out of all the little wrinkles that it has. It establishes that time travel's been invented, but instead of it being for great scientific exploitation and experimentation, it's been used to make package holidays. And the only place you can go from there is Prague. Prague's the only place you can go to do that. And there's all sorts of little details. There's the freeze ray, there's the washing up liquid, which is literally the most powerful thing I've ever seen. Bodies, it can get rid of just bodies like that. It's just all of these little details that don't need to be in there, but the colour it adds by having these wrinkles, it just elevates it, I think, way more and way higher. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, I think the last act of it in particular is like a domino rally where all of these little bits of apparent incidental colour, like the washing up liquid or the trampolines, just suddenly come back into it in a way that you never anticipated. And I think when you can see that pulled off well, it's such a beautiful thing.
Yes, there's a lot of details woven in, aren't there, that all are significant. It's like the car boot, for example, which keeps flipping up, or there is some significance, isn't there, to each detail.
Yeah.
And another thing I think is really impressive, and again doesn't really need to be, is just the recreation of like the Nazis too, and of Hitler and the other sort of Nazi figures, and although it's a comedy, I mean, they are kind of represented in a way that is quite frighteningly real. I would say. I think it's among the better sort of screen representations of Hitler and his various associates. I mean, it's like the makeup, the costumes, the weapons. It all looks really authentic.
Yeah, it has that quality that I really admired in Armando Iannucci's The Death of Stalin, where he knew that in order to make this funny, you need one person, which was like the Simon Russell Beale character in that film. You need one person who is just not funny at all. the scenes with Hitler can be funny. It's amazingly funny to watch Adolf Hitler being beset by some American tourists who've just landed on a time plane and want a selfie with him. But Hitler himself is played devastatingly straight.
And that moment where he is confronted with the film footage of like the outcome of the war is actually quite chilling, isn't it? I think it's actually quite moving in a weird way because it's. I read an interview with Polák where he said that was one of the things that he was he was pleased that he was able to do this in the film to show Hitler the consequences of his actions, which is quite a rare thing to. But that is taken totally straight, isn't it? Really.
Yeah. Is there anything else we can talk about in this one? We can if you want. Anything left?
There's tons of things, but part of it is you really. We talked about Stalker as an experience. This is an experience in a very different way because you just have to sit down and let yourself be hit by all of these extraordinary plot twists. I will say, I think it probably had like some extra layers for Czech and Slovak audiences at the time, because the guy who plays Hitler, as we said very well, František Vukana, also played the real-life Czech World War II hero Jan Zika, who's like a major figure in the Czech resistance a few years before it. So there's a few instances of novelty casting there that I think have been lost to time. But, one of the great benchmarks of whether a comedy works is if you can watch it without all the topical references and it still figures. And I think this absolutely does. It's got a kind of a farcical story about doubles that is as old as Shakespeare or, the Decameron or something. And it still absolutely fires on all cylinders in this context as well.
I think one really interesting point of comparison between this film and the other two films we've looked at is that I guess Tarkovsky and Szulkin are figures that we would say represented more of the let's say the critical trend in the Eastern Bloc, where they were working at odds with the state and they were making very critical comments in this kind of covert way, or in some way represented something subversive. Whereas I guess this kind of cycle of Czechoslovak comedies that the third film comes from, that's often been treated in Czechoslovakia or later in Czech scholarship or Czech criticism as something that was a little bit too close to the establishment, and it's been considered as something that was complicit somehow in the politics of the regime, because I guess this is the cinema that was popular in the 70s. This is after the Soviet invasion when Czechoslovakia they eliminated the new wave. But I think what's nice now is that we're able to rediscover a lot of these films. And I think because now they have, in a way, they transcend that context now. So now we are able to see them afresh.
Yeah.
So I think now it's nice to see that they're being rediscovered and we can see things in them. And I think there are little subversive things in them. There are little touches that we can pick up on. And so, yes, I think, looking at different trends or different traditions in these cinemas, I think is worthwhile, because I think we can see as many affinities now as there are differences. So, yeah, I think we've chosen a really good combination.
I don't think there's anything really left to mention. I think for the layman, the sort of comedy in Tomorrow I'll Wake Up and Skull Myself with Tea is one which is, I guess, in the UK sense, quite carry on, not quite as bawdy, but in the sense of it uses the sound effects and its larger than life character. Because I think the sound effects kind of make this work in a weird sort of sense. It feel a little flatter without this sort of hyper exaggerated sort of bouncy sound effects that score all of the things.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think if it was as funny as the plot is, if it was pure plot, the effort of keeping up with it might detract from the humour. Whereas here, there's always something funny going on a very superficial level. And there are also these hundreds of layers of very complicated, funny things going on a bit. I mean, one of the most childish things I love in it is just the bad synth version of the Death March that plays when the Nazi brother's coffin's taken out of the apartment. It's not a sophisticated gag, but it cracks me up every time.
It's got such a lovely little musical motif as well when they're doing the time travelling. I'm surprised in a sort of the way that Tarantino cannibalizes little musical stings from things that hasn't popped up somewhere else, because it's a very charming musical score that accompanies this, I feel. Yeah,
totally. Yeah, it's very disco. It's not what you think of when you think of, Soviet occupied countries in the 1970s, but it can boogie.
To wrap up then, we've covered sort of the idea of what Soviet cinema, Eastern Bloc sci-fi is. So I think just sort of moving further with that, I mean, it's very simple sort of recommendations of other movies that we may have done that cover the sort of the entire spectrum, really. So not just the movies like, I don't know, Dead Man's Letters, which seems to be in the same sort of register as Stalker and Obio Bar, but some more diverse titles that we could have talked about but maybe didn't have the time for, or didn't really jam with the selection. So is there anything that fill those descriptions from either of you?
I mean, I think as Graham said at the beginning, like I guess we didn't really cover any of that earlier period of like the films from the 50s or early 60s, which I think represent a rather more optimistic and I guess a more kind of space travel oriented type of science fiction. So I would say of that era, I would recommend, I think Icarus XB1, I think is to me one of the great films from Czechoslovakia, I think in any genre, but I think that, and of course has that famous distinction of possibly maybe having influenced 2001 A Space Odyssey. I mean, it's often, I think we do know that Kubrick at least did see it, so there is that interesting connection there. And in and of itself, it's a great movie, I think. There's also a really good East German Polish film called The Silent Star from, I think, around the same time, around 1960, I think, which has some beautiful color. It's a color film and has, some really quite beautiful. There's a beautiful sequence set on Venus in the wake of. This is going to make it sound depressing, but it's not. But in the wake of a nuclear catastrophe on Venus. But yeah, there's some really beautiful, quite for its time, quite surreal imagery in that. So yeah, I would recommend those, I think.
Some ones that stand out for me that I think do tend to be from that kind of 70s, 80s era. That's definitely the one I've explored more than the earlier stuff, I have to say. But we could have extended this to a fourth country. We could have done Dead Mountaineer's Hotel from Estonia, which is a film I really love. There was a time when there was a copy of it flitting about online, but maybe it's gone off. But this is based on a story by the Strugatsky brothers, who wrote Roadside Picnic, the novel which Stalker is based on. They also wrote the book that Hard to Be a God by Alexei German was based on. It's very much in that vein of very philosophical science fiction. This one is a mind control movie. It's got a very contained setting in the one hotel, but it's still as imaginatively free as any of the films that we've reviewed here is. And we've mentioned Zulowski a few times on this episode, so I just want to throw a word in for his great unfinished film On the Silver Globe, which was unobtainable for years, but is finally out there in a good Blu-ray edition from Eureka Masters of Cinema. An absolutely bizarre story that I cannot even begin to summarize, that in Zulowski's classic style is enacted through dance, makeup, huge, elaborate sets, grotesque torture scenes, orgies, fourth wall breaks. You know, I watched it and my overwhelming thought was, why do we waste so much time wondering what Alejandro Jodorowsky's Dune would have been like when this is real, this exists?
Yeah. I think I almost suggested that film for this, but then I thought that there might be the possibility that I might have to summarize it. So I thought, no, I'm not.
Well, yeah. Here's another question. You might not be able to answer it either of you, but we're talking about movies in the shadow of communism. Is there any movies that fit this bill post-communism, post-communist regime, or anything really? I mean, there's one that I saw recently from 2024 from Estonia, a movie from Munich Simet called The Black Hole, which is particularly interesting, portmanteau anthology movie, 3 different stories, one of which includes 2 middle-aged women who donate their bodies willingly to aliens to experiment on from the Andromeda Galaxy, which is quite a charming thing. And another one of the stories is basically love lies bleeding, but their house has been invaded by the most adorable spiders in cinema history. Giant spiders, I should add. So if you're kind of tired of all the movies misrepresenting giant spiders as a menace to society, this is I hope it gets a bigger release, but The Black Hole is a really charming little thing. But from the two of you, is anything else from the vast canvas of ex-Soviet states that maybe, because we've tied it all to this era, this specific era of living under the shadow of communism, but there is a happy after.
It's hard to say, because I think by the time the Berlin Wall falls and the Soviet Union starts its dissolution, you're entering a period where all of these countries feel like different places. I mean, they did anyway, and I think we've discussed 3 very different films here, but you can point to them as being kind of thematically tied together, as we have done, whereas it's like, after that, I think Russian science fiction feels like its own field of study. Czech science fiction is its own thing. Polish science fiction is. It becomes harder to think about it as a complete thing. But I do love German's Hard to Be a God. I don't know if I'll ever watch it again, but it's so good.
Yeah, it's a grueling movie, that one. Yeah.
Yes, I think it's the film from post-communist, that I think ties most closely to the kind of films we looked at, really.
Yeah, totally.
It's a hard recommend as well, Hard to Be a God, because it's just 2.5 hours of people rolling around in filth and being pretty horrible to each other.
Hang on, that's completely unfair. It's actually 3 hours.
Oh, is it as long as that? I misremembered it then. Yeah, definitely worth a watch, but yeah, maybe build up for that one. I think. I think that about covers it, really, doesn't it? Unless there's anything either of you have left to say on the topic before we put a nail in this one, put a drum board in it.
I mean, there's always tons you can say, but I think I'll restrict myself. I think that's 3 pretty analysis-worthy films that we have covered there.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know when this is going to come up again. That's why we're just fishing for that little extra bit. But Graham, where can we find you and the stuff you do online?
Well, my regular gig is as the host of Pop Screen, the sister podcast to this one, also on the Geek Show Network, where every week we take a look at another film either starring about or by a pop star. I also regularly write for the Geek Show. I'm currently migrating a very in-depth series of articles I did on classic series Doctor Who for the Patreon over to the main site. There's one of those that goes out every day. and I also write for Byline Times, and I'm currently putting the finishing touches to my part for a group exhibition of new video, sound and conceptual art at Woodend Gallery in Scarborough, which opens in January 2025.
Very, very good. And Jonathan?
So yes, I'm still writing. I write commentaries and booklet essays for Blu-ray releases. I recently did one for the Deaf Crocodile release of A Day Has Not Had Supper Yet.
Hey.
Another great, crazy, long title Czechoslovak comedy.
Great movie.
And yeah, one of my favourites, and that was released a few months ago. And I wrote a booklet essay for Second Run's upcoming release of what was the first Czechoslovak film musical called The Hop Pickers, which is a wonderful kind of like earworm-laden musical about labour brigades in the 1960s, which is a lot of fun. And I also produce articles occasionally for the Czech National Film Archives website. So I'm actually working on one at the moment about tomorrow I will wake up and scald myself with tea. So hopefully I'll be finishing that soon, and it should be on the website soon, I guess.
Very, very good. And you can find myself across all social media platforms as Uncut Robcast. If you want to get in touch with the show, email us at directorsuncutpod@gmail.com. And don't forget to give the show a rating and a review, because I have to say that it's like nails down a chalkboard saying it, but I have to say it. But until next time, when we'll be kicking off a double bill of episodes about Guillermo del Toro, thank you very, very much for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.